Welcome back to Code Over Time. My name is Kev, and in this video, I want to give a quick interview of Django and how we use Django in Varcade Games. So if I open up our website, we have, which should be pretty familiar at this point, Varcade Games, and we have all of our games loaded. So to get all of these games, we discussed in the past that if we look at our system architecture, we have our Varcade Games client, and our client sends a request to the Varcade Games server, which will get data from the MySQL database that's attached at the back end. So we call get games to the server. So going to this server is kind of what we want to do in this video. Just as a refresher, I covered this in a previous video, but if we go back here, inspect, network, reload, and I'm just going to zoom in here. So we do a request to a server to games/v1/games, and that returns us some JSON. And this JSON here, it should be pretty familiar. So all of our objects in here, for example, 3D pool, there's 3D pool, bgrand there. This is battle grannies, which we can see here. So we send a request to that endpoint, which, like I said, is going from the client to this Varcade Games server. And the server, like I said, will read from the database and send that back. So this server here is implemented in Django. So in our project, again, if you have the project up and running, we do make PS from our build directory, you'll see we have this game portal here. And the game portal is up. It's listening on port 8000, which is, of course, why, if you remember our admin panel, this is port 8000, localhost 8000/admin. That is the port that this is on. So when we're looking at the code, this is the container that code is running on. It's the game portal container. So first off, Django. What is Django? Well, if we go to the website, Django, they claim to make it easier to build better web apps more quickly and with less code. So it's a Python backend. It's a fairly heavyweight framework. They say the web framework for perfectionists with deadlines. And the reason for that is they put a lot of effort into making this kind of performant and fast and doing all the things that you typically do when you're deploying some sort of web server, right? So they do a lot of work on performance. They focus a lot on security. So things like, for example, interacting with your SQL database, they're going to make it so that you interact with the database in such a way that you're minimizing risk of attacks like SQL injection and stuff like that. If you don't know what SQL injection is, we'll probably cover it in the future. Don't worry about it for now. But they try and remove the overhead of having to deal with security problems so you don't have to think about it and you can focus on building your app, right? It's also very scalable. Of course, this is the sales pitch. People might argue or disagree with all that stuff, but you can come to the Django website to get more information on Django, but I want to just kind of jump straight into the code, to be honest. So if we open up an editor, basically here on the left, we have if we go to our website directory, to server and to game portal, this is our Django project. And like I said already, it's in Python, and every Django project is going to have a couple of things that will be instantly familiar. So a settings.py and a urls.py. You're going to see both of these things. And if we open up the settings.py, this is a file that basically is a whole bunch of settings for our project, including some secret keys. I'm not going to blur this out. This doesn't matter. We're not putting this on a production server. If you were, as the comment says, you want to make sure you keep this sort of thing secret. So we basically configure our application, like media URL, for example, that says /media. So if we go to our admin panel, and let's say we go to here, the directory, if we open up one of the images that we uploaded for one of our games, you can see it's localhost 8000 /media/images, right? So we can already start to see in our settings file for our Django project, we've got some connections to the things that are going on that we've seen so far in the website. We also install some apps. So with Django, what you do is you have a kind of a core Django framework, and then you can add things on top of it. And again, this settings file, we don't want to worry too much about all of the specifics, but this is where the configuration for your website lives. And with Django, you do a lot through configuration, and that's kind of the point in a web framework, right? When you use a framework like this, and they're like Ruby on Rails is an example of a framework. You can use Spring in the Java world. There's lots of different frameworks you can use, and they tend to do a lot of the heavy lifting, but there's a big kind of trade-off that you have to make where a lot of stuff just kind of happens magically. And when something breaks, it can be hard to understand why it's breaking. So for example, I might configure something in this settings file, and if it doesn't work as expected, I don't know why it's not working. I've put in some setting and Django's doing some magic in the background to make things work. And if it doesn't work, well, debugging can become a little bit more difficult. And getting to the level where you're an expert with a framework is similar to getting to the level where you're an expert with a programming language. You just got to spend a lot of time with it, and you got to get familiar with it. You got to learn when it breaks, why it breaks, All of these sorts of things, they just kind of, hands-on experience is the only way to get there. You can go read reams of documentation, but again, your project's going to be different, your environment's going to be different, your requirements are going to be different. So it's really important that you just get hands-on time with this sort of thing. And as a professional developer, this is what will happen when you get a job. And if your job is using a framework like Django, you will spend day in, day out, 8 hours a day or whatever, 8 hours a day minus however many meetings you have. You will spend kind of in Django working on your code in Django, and you will just get to learn it. But that's kind of the only way to do it. You just got to be hands-on. So this is our settings file. Again, anywhere in our project we can kind of reference things from the settings file. So for example here, I've got Redis stream host, and we talked about how we use Redis before, and we've got a couple of configuration values for that. If I scroll up, we can set things like expiry for tokens, where we use these JSON web tokens basically for some of our authentication. We've got some stuff around how we store images, and we've got different settings depending on whether we're in a test environment versus when we're in a production environment. So all of that sort of stuff goes in our settings file, and it becomes a big complicated thing where a lot of your app is kind of configured. If we look at URLs, we can start to see some familiar stuff in here where, for example, games/v1, right? If you remember when we go back here, games/v1/games, that's how we actually fetch our games. So here this is where we're basically defining all the roots of our app. And again, in any Django application, you're going to see your settings, you're going to see your URLs. But the way Django really works to help us is we've got these different modules. So in our project, we've got accounts. So our user logs in, our user can register. We've got games, which we've already talked about. The web portal loads the games. And we've got profiles. So this is where we store information about the user. So I think you probably have to re-log in. When you log in, we fetch profile information about the user. So the profile is a little bit different than the account. A profile might include things like a player's level, a player's XP, all that sort of stuff. The public displayable information, whereas the account is your private account information. But let's look at games, since that's kind of primarily what we're interested in. And in Django, what we can do is when we want to store something in the database, we can create a Python class. So we're saying a class called game, and we're extending models.model. Now this models is Django is being imported from Django DB. And what we're doing here is basically we're defining a lot of things like game ID, name, description, client URL, cover art. And these are all being mapped to models.char field or image field or whatever it is. And this is basically how we configure an object in Django to say we want to store this object in the database. And straight away, all of these fields here, game ID, name, description, client URL, they should be immediately familiar to us, because if you remember in our admin panel, we start to see name, game ID, description, client URL, all of these things. So interestingly, and this is where Django does a lot of the heavy lifting again, where if I come back over here to our file tree and I open admin, in this file I just needed to say admin.site.register game. That's all I had to do to get this game management interface here in the Django admin console. So by registering that model, which is a Django model, as a model in the admin, it automatically takes it here and creates an entry in our admin page, and then each one of these is basically an instance of our game model. So every time we come in here and we say we want to create a new, so every time we add a game, so if I click add, it gives us a bunch of empty fields here. Well, all we're doing is actually filling in these fields. And then with Django, we can just say, save that model, and we are good to go. If we look at views, for example, so this views is where we mapped our URL, and we can create something called a view set, where here all we're doing is querying the database. We're saying game, which is our model, objects.filter, and we're saying get me any games that are active or any games that are coming soon. We're ordering by name. We provide a class which will actually serialize, so write this information to JSON. And just doing this will now create an entire REST API where we can fetch all of our games and we can interact with the game model. So like I said, Django will do a lot of this heavy lifting, but a lot of it is kind of magic, right? You're not writing the code that goes to the database and submits the query and pulls back the data and formats it and orders it and sends it back to the client. You're kind of providing a lot of meta information that allows Django to go do all of that work. And like I said, when you're not used to it, it can be very, very difficult. And this is the reason I picked Django to build the admin panel or to build the game portal server in, because I wanted to provide some exposure to this way of working, to working with a framework where you're not writing the code to do the thing. You're more providing configuration and settings and meta information to let the framework do the thing, right? So Django is what we would probably call an opinionated framework. There's a very specific way that you work with Django. So that's kind of all I wanted to talk about in this video. I wanted to keep a quick, very, very brief introduction to Django and kind of frameworks in general. Again, some benefits there where they do a lot of the heavy lifting for us. They abstract away a lot of the complexity of building out some sort of web server, things like security and performance and all that sort of stuff. But they're very opinionated. You have to work in a certain way, and a lot of the stuff can kind of just happen as if by magic, which especially for beginners, it can make it very difficult to debug. And again, the reason I wanted to include a framework in Varcade Games is for anyone who's working on this project to get some experience of what it's actually like to work with a framework like this. There are upsides, there are downsides. Experience them for yourself and come to your own conclusions. I think in general, if you've got a relatively small, any sort of small web-based project, and when I say small, I'm talking maybe tens of thousands of users, I think a framework is just a great way to go. If you've got a small team, especially, there's a lot of stuff you just don't want to be dealing with. We're going to look at a much more lighter weight framework when we get into the matchmaker and get into the stats tracking, and you'll see kind of how we just have to write a lot more code and we have to do a lot more thinking. That's it for this video. In the next video, I actually want to talk about some problems that we have here around scale. So here we are requesting games and we are returning our list of games. And right now our list of games only has like 9 games in it, right? So we can go to our database, we can fetch 9 games, and we can send them to the client. That's easy. What would happen if we had 100,000 games, right? So we get some problems when we start to think about larger scale, and that's what I want to talk about in the next video. But for today, intro to Django. Hopefully this was useful. Any questions, as always, throw them in the comments or join the Discord. And that's it. Thank you for watching.